All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about the development of state legislatures. And this is an important, particularly in a state like Pennsylvania where we have a professionalized state legislature. But throughout the country there are different variations of the way that state legislatures operate. And some are more professional than others. So for example, a state like Pennsylvania, New York, California, these types of states really are on par really with the amount of workload and the length of term and the amount of money that people make. Very similar to what we would expect from members of Congress in that they're pretty much there full-time. It's a full-time job year-round. They've got significant presence, office space, both in their districts and in the state capitals, very similar to what we would expect from U.S. representatives or U.S. senators. On the other hand, we have other smaller states in which, really for the most part, these are what we call citizen legislatures. And in these legislatures, people are paid very little. And people generally have very short terms. In some states, there are actually only sessions once every other year rather than annually. And what we're going to do is take a look at how we got to this situation. And the evolution of legislatures, particularly kind of from the literature that Alan Rosenthal's written that we've kind of discussed a little bit before, it really has shown us that since the 1950s and 1960s, state legislatures have become much more capable of solving the problems of their citizens. At one point, state governments were considered to be really the middlemen that were incapable of handling any type of problem. And now we see that they are sophisticatedly handling a lot of problems. And in many cases in which the federal government has failed to act, will actually take on the initiative to be able to solve their policy problems for their people. So how does that happen? How do we get there? What's the evolution of state legislatures? What do they look like around the country? What are the diversity of these institutions? Those are the types of things that we're going to talk about today. So just a quick picture here. If you take a look at the Capitol, which is what we just see here, that's the Capitol in Harrisburg, which by the way is one of the most beautiful in the country and very ornate on the inside. This is a view from the back of the Capitol. See the Susquehanna River there in the background. And what you'll notice is that there's a main Capitol building and a couple of office buildings on the side. The entire back portion of this, which I wish I could kind of point to here, but I can't really. If you see the water fountain and anything beyond the main Capitol building, which has the kind of green copper roof on it, all of that really was created in the late 1980s. And it was part of a larger movement within the United States to provide more office space for members of the state legislature so that they could have their own offices and they could have their own staffs and become more professionalized. Now, the interesting thing, of course, this being Pennsylvania, there was obviously a whole bunch of controversy about this being built and cost overruns and kickbacks from contractors and all that kind of stuff. But that's relatively new, and you'll see that as you go around the country. The same thing happened in Albany and New York around the same time, was these big expansions of the state legislatures to provide more office space and to allow people to be more capable in solving the problems of the state legislature. Now, one of the things about state legislatures is in recent years we've seen very competitive elections around the country. 30 years ago, most state legislatures were dominated by Democrats. If we take a look at this map here, this is as a consequence of the 2016 elections. It does say here New York's still being decided. New York is a split legislature between Republicans and Democrats. But what you generally see is this map pretty much mirrors what you'd expect if we took a look at the electoral map of the United States. And that is that typically red states are dominated by Republicans, typically blue states are dominated by Democrats. And Republicans do control the chamber in 32 states, Democrats in 13, and 4 states, including New York there, have split control, meaning that one house is dominated by Republicans and one dominated by Democrats. Now, in looking at this, if you take a look at a lot of these red states, you say, well, geez, that's 32 states. That's a lot. It seems Republicans have a majority of the country, and they do have a majority of the amount of state legislators around the country. But also take a look at the states that are blue, and states, some of them are very high population states: Illinois, California, New Jersey, Maryland, and there are some interesting states there that you wouldn't typically believe were dominated by Republicans, like Michigan and Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, in which we have more than 1 million more Democrats than Republicans. But Democrats have been losing gradually at the state level over the last couple of decades. So at the beginning of the session in 2017, this is the breakdown for all of the legislators in the United States. So there are roughly in the United States about 7,300 state legislators. Around the country, if we take a look at this, what you can see is that the total state senators around the country, there are 972. There are 1,158 Republicans and 804 Democrats. If we take a look at the Pennsylvania State Senate, there are 50 state senators in Pennsylvania. 34 of those are Republican and 16 are Democrats. Again, somewhat remarkable given the fact that we have such a dominating presence of Democrats in Pennsylvania. Around the country, there are 5,411 House seats, and Republicans again here have an advantage, 3,047 to 2,339. And the Pennsylvania Republicans dominate the Pennsylvania House. We have 203 seats in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, 121 Republicans, 81 Democrats, and 1 vacant at the present time. Now, what's interesting here, although probably not very surprising if you're a student of American politics, is that there are very few independents or others, right? So around the country, there are only 35 seats that are either independent, other, or vacant. So what we don't see around the country is a large presence of people other than Democrats or Republicans. And what's interesting is if we take a look at the actual states in which there are independents, we'll just flip down here for a second, you can see here that of the independents, the majority of those independents around the country, which only total 23 people in 7 states, 13 of these are actually from the state of Vermont, right? So if we discount, a relatively small population state like Vermont, which has its own kind of historical political independence streak, we see that there are really only about 10 other people around the country out of those more than 7,000 legislators that are of third parties. Now, what's interesting about that is if we take a look at those people, the Vermont Progressive Party, which is really kind of an offshoot of Bernie Sanders' kind of historical relationship to the state of Vermont, most of those people that are independents are Vermont progressives, meaning that they're a bit left of the Democratic Party, and that would account for most of those people in that state. So one of the things that we talk about state legislatures and their changes over recent decades is something called the increased capacity of state legislatures. And Bowman and Kearney, who are 2 scholars of state politics and state government in general, talk about the 3 areas of capacity building that has taken place, not just within the context of state legislatures over recent decades, but the context of state government more broadly. But what capacity is really government's ability to respond to change and conflict efficiently, right? And the 3 aspects of that ability to be able to respond are, 1, the ability to identify the problems that face their constituents and face the state. Second of all is the ability to be able to identify solutions to those problems that adapt well enough to deal with, again, the specific political conditions, socioeconomic conditions of their state. And then finally, and this might probably be the most difficult aspect, is to actually execute and implement those policy solutions, and then on an ongoing basis continue to evaluate how well these solutions work and how changes need to be made, right? So as part of that capacity building, we really need then to have larger staffs and to have kind of more well-trained people that are able to find these solutions. How do we get to that point? Well, if we take a look at these trends that have developed since the 1950s and 60s, Alan Rosenthal takes a look at this idea of capacity, and with improved capacity, there's more professionalization of state legislatures and greater careerism, right? If you have more staff around you and you have the ability to solve problems and you're getting paid fairly well, it's more likely that you're going to stay in your job for a while. And that in turn increases the capacity because there isn't as much turnover. People then have kind of an institutional knowledge of what's worked in the past and what hasn't worked, and solutions that are good and bad, and what's been accepted by the citizenry. And you know, what we've also seen, particularly since the 1990s, is while there has been this uptick of institutionalization of state legislatures, meaning making them stronger, there's also been, in some states, a complete reaction to this, and that's led to what we can call the deinstitutionalization of state legislatures. And we'll see that a couple of modules down the line when we talk about the idea of term limits, right? Now, one of the big things that we see that has led towards the modernization of the state legislatures is a series of cases that have occurred in the 1960s that dealt with the reapportionment of state legislatures and also congressional seats at the state level. And it was really the United States Supreme Court in this series of cases called the reapportionment cases that made, I guess you could say, even dragged state legislatures into the 20th century midway through that century. What I'd like you to do right now, and again, I apologize for this, but we don't have the capabilities right now to be able to click through and have sound from this video, is to take a couple minutes and turn this video off and cut and paste the video there and watch the kind of overview of Baker versus Carr. And then we'll come back in a couple minutes and talk a little bit more specifically about what this means. All right, so reapportionment. So what we generally had over the course of the 20th century, really starting back in the 19th century, was a movement of people from rural areas to predominantly urban areas. We went from being an agrarian agricultural country to being a much more industrialized country. And you know, we don't often think right now in kind of our post-industrial cities, we don't really think about there being heavy manufacturing plants within the downtowns of most large cities, but that's the way it was in the late 1900s and early the early 20th century. And what happened was people moved off the farms into the cities, and we never really changed the state legislatures to reflect that. Now think about that. Think about why that might be. If the number one goal of members of Congress and members of state legislatures is re-election, why would you change the composition of state legislatures? Traditionally, rural areas had dominated state legislators. However, as people move to the cities, naturally you would think that there would now be more state legislators representing those city areas. But who gets to make the rules of how you reallocate or reapportion states? The people that are already in power. So think about it. If you happen to be a state legislator who's from a rural area and you now dominate the state legislature, are you going to want to change that state legislature to give more power to urban areas, or are you going to want to keep that power for yourself within the context of keeping more rural power? Well, what we saw in most states was the rural areas said, we're not going to reapportion our districts, we're not going to redraw the boundaries after we get new census data. Sure, we know people move to the cities, but we're not going to worry about that, right? So eventually the Supreme Court gets involved. And really going down to the kind of idea of one person, one vote, what we saw was that the Supreme Court of the United States, starting with the Baker versus Carr decision, which you just saw in 1962, basically started to say, starting with U.S. House districts, that basically all of your districts within your state had to be more or less the same size, meaning they had to have the same amount of people. Why? Well, take a look here, for example. In 1962 in the state of Tennessee, their House districts ranged from 2,300 people in one district to 42,000 in another. New Jersey, for example, and this was fairly typical of most states when it came to their state senate, I mean, think in terms of the way the U.S. Senate's set up, most of the state senates were set up on the basis of county level, right? So counties had seats, regardless of the amount of population that you'd have. I mean, think about it here. I think the smallest county in Pennsylvania is Forest County. There are about 15,000, 20,000 people there. Imagine Forest County having the same amount of Pennsylvania senators as Philadelphia with 1.5 million people, right? It was kind of the concept of what was happening here. So in New Jersey in 1962, because the Senate seats were allocated by county, they varied from the size of 49,000 to 920,000. Now think about that. That means that your vote is completely diluted compared to a person living in that smallest county if you happen to be in the biggest county, right? I'm one of 49,000 people one place, one of almost 1 million in another. My vote means more in those counties that are smaller. Here's another kind of look here at what happens in the average state Senate districts around the country. This was in 1964, and you can see that Maryland had the worst mismatch here. The smallest district versus the largest district was 31, almost 32 times as large, right? So Supreme Court comes along initially in the Baker versus Carr decision and says that U.S. House districts ought to be the same. And then in a case called Reynolds versus Sims in 1964, which is a case that was brought on the basis of Alabama's malapportionment, basically the Supreme Court said not only does this apply to U.S. House districts, but it applies to state legislatures as well. The idea of one person, one vote. And here's a couple of kind of classic quotes that come out of here. And the majority in this case says, legislators represent people, not trees or acres. Legislators are elected by voters, not farms or cities or economic interests, right? So the idea here is that, a county is a political territory, yes, but it should not be the one that we shouldn't designate our political seats around that. And the Supreme Court in this case, Reynolds versus Sims, also said diluting the weight of votes because a place of residence impairs basic constitutional rights under the 14th Amendment, just as much as invidious discriminations based upon factors such as race or economic status, right? Invidious discrimination essentially meaning just overt discrimination. So they were making the argument here that the reason why some of these states didn't want to reapportion was essentially a civil rights issue, right? And under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment in Reynolds versus Sims, the Supreme Court said that this one person, one vote, all the districts within a state legislature had to have pretty much equal amounts of people in them. Now, here's what's always interested me. And I had a conversation a couple weeks ago with one of a law professor at Widener University's Commonwealth School of Law, and we were just talking a little bit about state government, and just by chance Reynolds versus Sims came up. And I said, there's always been something that's bothered me about this case. And I've just never quite understood this clause or this citing in Reynolds versus Sims. And here it is. In Reynolds versus Sims, what happens is that the U.S. Supreme Court says that both House and Senates in the state level both have to be apportioned on the basis of population. Now think about that for a second. Otherwise, it's unconstitutional and a violation of the 14th Amendment equal protection. Wouldn't that make the U.S. Senate unconstitutional? I take a look at, Delaware, Montana, Idaho, all have the same representation in the United States Senate as Texas, Florida, California, New York, Illinois. They're not one person, one vote. There's a mismatch there. And here's what the Supreme Court basically says in response to that. They said, no, that doesn't really apply to the states, right? He says, the U.S. Senate arose from unique historical circumstances. It's based on the consideration that in establishing our type of federalism, a group of formerly independent states bound themselves together under one national government. In other words, what happens here is that the colonies, which became states, came into the Union, saying that they were indestructible. It's part of our federal system, part of our whole national government, that they should have representation on the base of territory. And essentially, the court goes on to say political subdivisions of states, counties, cities, or whatever, never were and never have been considered as sovereign entities, which was true. And according to a law from an Iowa judge back in the 1860s called Dillon's Rule, local governments are creatures of the state, and for the most part, states are able to define and redefine the boundaries of localities. So what the Supreme Court's saying here is that states are indestructible, local governments aren't. As a consequence of that, state senates should be one person, one vote, because there is no kind of constitutional guarantee that Berks County should exist as Berks County. If Pennsylvania wanted to abolish it and merge it with another county, they could do so. The short of it is, if you're not interested in constitutional history, since that, what we've seen is that there's been a reallocation of seats, and every 10 years after the census, we rebalance our state legislative seats on the basis of population, which means that you carve out new areas. So that's a first overview of some of the changes that have gone on, and we will take a look at a couple of other things in the next couple of modules.